All right, so we're finally get to. I think I got this part here. Where make sure. Um. All right, so he says. Hot news from history. It's one thing to say that the Gospels are rooted in direct or indirect eyewitness testimony. It's another to claim that this information was reliably preserved until it was finally written down years later. This I knew was a major point of contention, and I wanted to challenge, I'm sure you did, and I wanted to challenge Blomberg with this issue as forthrightly as I could. Again, I picked up Karen Armstrong's popular book, A History of God. Listen to something else she wrote, I said. We know very little about Jesus. The first full-length account of his life was St. Mark's Gospel, which was not written until about the year 70, some 40 years after his death. By that time, historical facts had been overlaid with mythical elements which expressed the meaning Jesus had acquired for his followers. It is the meaning that St. Mark primarily conveys rather than reliable, straightforward portrayal. Tossing the book back into my open briefcase where it belongs.
I love that that's what he does with this book.
Yes.
Former known. He's also a female. And they're easily deceived. I don't know if you pick up on that Karen is a female name.
Yeah. I turned to Blomberg and continued. Some scholars talk a lot of nonsense. They say the Gospels were written so far after the events.
Mostly the female ones.
And the Greeks were written so far after the events that legend developed and distorted what was finally written down, turning Jesus from merely a wise teacher into the mythical Son of God. Is that a reasonable hypothesis? Or is there good evidence that the Gospels were recorded earlier than that, before legend could totally corrupt what was ultimately recorded? So closing out here at the very end, they're talking about the mythology angle of it. And basically what Karen Armstrong said is that, Jesus died somewhere around AD 30. Mark was written around AD 70. And by this time, legends had grown about this Jesus guy and that he had risen from the dead. By the way, didn't mention it, but the earliest writings about Jesus come from the Apostle Paul, everybody. And Paul's earliest writings date back to around AD 50. Earlier we were mentioning, my throat. Earlier we were mentioning that there are no verified eyewitness contemporary testimony of Jesus written down anywhere. The closest thing we have to that is the Apostle Paul. And we have several writings by Paul, and Paul was alive around the same time. He definitely would have overlapped. But Paul himself admits he never met the man. Paul's like, nope, never saw him. He's like, I saw him in a vision after he was dead, which I'm sorry, does not count for historical accuracy as a contemporary witness. But Paul's the closest person we have that actually wrote something down that knew Jesus. Sorry again. But the writings, like we mentioned that in John, you get a lot more of the magic shit, a lot more of the miracles and the deification and shit like that. Reading Paul is fascinating because Paul never mentions the virgin birth. Very weird that Paul never mentions the virgin birth. And so it almost seems like by the time Mark was written, the legend had kind of grown to the fact that, oh, by the way, Jesus was born of a virgin. And that's what they're referencing here, that, all this time had passed and that, these are oral traditions and people tell their fish stories and they grow more and more. And you might be surprised to hear this, but old Blomberg didn't take this too well. He thought this was poppycock. So after he tosses Karen Armstrong's garbage book back into the briefcase, Blomberg states,
should have thrown it trash can.
I don't want to hear anything else from that bitch about Jesus as far as I'm around. He says, the standard scholarly dating, even in very liberal circles. I gotta pause here. I'm sorry. One thing that I miss hearing a lot whenever I would debate believers about this stuff, about biblical history and stuff, they would always say, well, even most atheist scholars believe that Jesus existed and was a person. And it's like, what do you mean? Do you have a list of atheist scholars? Is there some database where they write down whether or not they're atheist? It doesn't exist.
I don't know how many times he says stuff like that over and over again through here.
Oh, does he? Oh, man.
Bible scholars say, it's been assumed, like, I don't know how many times, and I'm like, where are you citing these sources? You just say all these things are true, and there's nothing to let me know that it is.
We're going to check it.
Like, if I had any real doubts about these things being true, like, you did nothing to prove them.
Yeah. And they'll always appeal to, well, this is believed by even the atheist scholars, like even the liberal atheist scholars.
All the atheist scholars' names.
I know, right? Where is this written down? How do you know that? Where's this database? Yeah,
I'm an atheist scholar.
Nobody does that. No, because you know why? Because it's irrelevant. Like that it is irrelevant. If you are an atheist scholar, if you're a Buddhist scholar, it doesn't matter. Like the facts are the facts, regardless of what religious beliefs you hold. And so it's like the liberal scholars even believe it. It just cracks me up when they do that. But it says the standard scholarly dating, even in very liberal circles, is Mark in the 70s, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, John in the 90s. But listen, that's still within the lifetimes of various eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus, including hostile eyewitnesses who would have served as corrective if false teachings about Jesus were going around. Consequently, these late dates for the Gospels really aren't all that late. In fact, we can make a comparison that's very instructive. The two earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch more than 400 years after Alexander's death in 323 BC. Yet historians consider them to be generally trustworthy. Yes, legendary material about Alexander did develop over time, but it was only in the centuries after those two writers. In other words, the first 500 years kept Alexander's story pretty much intact. Legendary material began to emerge over the next 500 years. So whether the Gospels were written 60 or 30 years after the life of Jesus, the amount of time is negligible by comparison. It's almost a non-issue. Did you have anything on that segment, Heather? I have a lot, so I'll let you go first. But I have a lot on this one.
Like, all that I thought is kind of similar to what I was thinking before, is like, I don't know if any of that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Like, off the top of my head. I don't know for sure. That I'm sure I could find out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like what I kept thinking as I was reading this chapter. I'm like, I wish I had like a month to prepare for this, because then I could like go through and actually see which of these claims are real and which ones aren't. But there's so many, and he doesn't trace the chain of evidence in a compelling way. Like, so I could know from this book alone, like, footnotes to prove these things are true. So I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going off of like just the book itself,
mm-hmm.
because I don't have time, to like go research all of these facts, I would have to say, oh, that's a pretty good argument, I guess. I know Alexander the Great was real. I learned about him in school. And I don't know much about him really, I guess, other than that he was great, and he
was great.
lands, that his name was Alexander, and I think he had a wife named something with a Z or something like that. Can't remember.
I don't know.
And I don't remember much about him at all. And so, and I keep thinking, and I have, like I said, the credentials I said before, like I have completed a higher level of education than like the majority of people in the country I live in. And that's where I'm at. I'm like, I don't know if this is true or not, but if it is true, which I'm assuming it is, or else it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a pretty good argument, I guess. Like, I find it hard to believe that like for 500 years, nobody wrote it down, and like all the facts were accurate that whole time. That seems like an insane claim, because I'm like, that's twice as long as my country's been around.
I know, right? Imagine if no one had written
anything down about Alexander the Great's life, because I thought they had written word by that time. And like, surely people would have written stuff down, and like, it does make sense that people would have made up stories, but I'm like, why would they not have made up stories for 500 fucking years? Like 500 years ago, we were in like the Renaissance era, or era, depending which way you like, or I guess now it's 2021. So yeah, like the Middle Ages, I think, or like the Renaissance era, somewhere in there.
Protestant Reformation times.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 1500s.
Yeah.
21 minus, yeah, sorry. So long time ago. And like, I feel like we have pretty good record, like from people who were alive at the time, like really good documentation about what was happening. But I know that's a lot later than Alexander the Great was
Yeah.
alive. So like I'm just thinking through all of those things. Like if I couldn't research it, like if I was alive in the 90s and I didn't have the internet,
Yeah.
I'd be like, this is a pretty convincing
Yeah.
argument, I guess. Like it doesn't really make sense that it's true, but he's saying it's true. So I guess it is. Like that was kind of my takeaway. It's like, yeah, that seems, but it seems weird that nobody would have made up stories until after the 500 years.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
they did. So that was where I was at with that. I was like, I don't know what to make of this without researching it more.
Yeah. So what I wrote when I read this is actually something we mentioned before. That this is where apologists do a weird bait and switch. This is like, it is a go-to move. It's very similar to what they've done before, where they tried to demonstrate that a theological claim is true by pointing to a non-theological historical claim. And so they'll say, look, well, we know Alexander the Great was real. Nobody disputes this, right? But the first biography we have about Alexander comes around AD 100. And Alexander died 400 years before that. So, but no one disputes that Alexander was fake, right? We're all in agreement on that. So Jesus' first biography shows up 10 times quicker. It shows up 40 years after his death. And you guys are wondering if he's actually God. Why? If you're willing to believe Alexander was a king, even though there's no writings until 400 years after his death, why aren't you willing to believe Jesus is God if there's writing? Which is not two very different claims, and because it's talking about the mythology, right? Like, or we're saying that this is all a myth because it's written 40 years later, but 400 years, and you're not. It's like the myths are not the same. Like one guy is God, one guy is a dude who won a lot of battles. But so what you're saying is correct. It does seem strange that Alexander the Great, who was alive in the AD 300s, dies and no one writes anything down about him for 400 years. How do we know? And so here's the thing. It is like a purpose. He's being purposefully deceptive, which is like part of the gig of being an apologist.
Feeling I got
It's
from
purposefully deceptive because it is true. He's not lying. It is true that the only surviving biography of Alexander the Great, the oldest surviving biography we have of Alexander the Great does come from Plutarch around AD 100 or so. However, those are not the only writings about Alexander, right? Like there are a few contemporary sources of Alexander who did write about him that we don't have anymore, that we just don't have them. But people did reference them. Several people from different locations saying, like is quoted in this book by Alexander's general, people who didn't know each other, and they all say the same thing. So that book did exist, and the book does go further back. But as far as like surviving records, there are no surviving biographies of Alexander. However, I wrote down what we have here. Let's see. We do have decrees from Alexander the Great of him arbitrating land disputes. There are references, inscriptions, coins, cities, testimonies written by other people citing the same primary sources for the days of Alexander. And we also have fragments from the Babylonian Chronicles. Babylon is a very old city, as we all know. And the Babylonian Chronicles stretched for 500 years from around from 700 BC to around 200 BC. Alexander lived in the 300s, and there are inscriptions that the Babylonians, not even people who lived in Macedonia, like people who lived hundreds of miles away, saying, "Oh yeah, this Alexander guy, he's kicking a lot of ass." And they write down like they even write down when he died. So that is mountains of evidence for someone who lived like 2,400 years ago, that we have like, not only the inscriptions, references from people who would have known him, but survived. Actually, hold on, I pulled it up here. I got too carried away in my thing. What do we have here? All right, this is the Alexander and Arabian Chronicle from the Babylonians, and the Babylonian Chronicle concerning Alexander Arabia is one of the Mesopotamian chronicles written in ancient Babylonia. and Hellenistic period. It deals with the events from the last. It's from the year after this happened, right, of the real year of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. For a very brief introduction to the literary genre of Chronicles. This is anyway. This is like them writing about Alexander the Great the year after he won a battle. We have this, like it exists. So so when he says that, the oldest biography we have doesn't show up for 400 years, that's true. But there's a lot of evidence that were not biographies, and even so, like it doesn't address like the actual point, like, is Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God, which is the whole point of this, right? Like, Jesus being real is one argument. Like, if you want to make that one, fine. But if you want to say he's God, saying, well, the Gospels popped into existence a couple of decades after death, which as historic ain't, as far as antiquity goes, not that far. Not it's really that's pretty close. That's pretty fucking good, honestly. But if you're gonna say he's got, like, if, for example, if let's say the biography of Alexander the Great wasn't written in AD 100. Let's say it was written in 322 BC, the day before Alexander died. Let's say it goes all the way back to that. If it said he could fly, or that he could teleport, or that he could, talk to that's a legend already. It doesn't matter if it was written when he died, before he died, or after he died. Once you start incorporating magic into it, it's going to be slotted as legend. Like, the proximity to the death is kind of unnecessary, but they act like, since it was so close to his death, well, that's proof that it's real. And I hate that. Apologists love to do this, where they'll talk about, we have very little evidence for a lot of these historical figures. And so, the fact that we don't have for Jesus, just take it on our word that the magic is real,
That is a good point. It's the magical thinking that is, I don't know. I mean, I guess because
they pretend that's not the actual case they're talking about here, because they pretend they're talking about the historicity of Jesus, which is I think it is.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like the claim they're specifically supporting here at the beginning of the section is the Gospels are rooted in direct or eyewitness testimony, and the information was reliably preserved until it was written down years later. That's the claim. Not necessarily that Jesus is God, but it's like, we know Jesus is God because of that. But
they're talking about the legend in the mythology is what they're talking about, because this part right here, I know what I should have wrote the page numbers down. Sorry, but
I'm on it. 30.
It's where he says, like, the scholarly standard of dating. Where is this? Oh yeah. The page before this, it'll talk about where it's good. But in other words, the 500 years. So he's saying the 500 years of Alexander, there was no legend. 500 years later, the legend grew. So there wasn't enough time for legends to grow in the 40, which is stupid, by the way. It was just really, really stupid. But they were saying that it wasn't legendary shit. Like this, the mythology didn't creep in. There wasn't enough time for mythology to grow in those 40 years.
Yeah, like, I didn't know all of the historical facts you just said, which would be really helpful to know going into this. But I don't think most people would know that.
No chance. No chance. I mean, no chance.
No one who reads this would know all of that stuff that you said to be true. So if you didn't know that, though, I think you could still take away what you just said, which was the false equivalence. And I'm trying to kind of trace that, because he's saying we can believe the veracity of what is written in the Gospels because they were written in close proximity in chronological time to when the events described in the documents occurred. And those events were experienced firsthand by either the author of the documents or firsthand by the person being interviewed by the author of the documents. And so because of that, we can believe everything the documents claim to be true. And one of the ways that we know, one piece of evidence that proves this is that Alexander the Great definitely existed. Nobody disputes that. And nobody wrote down a biography about
Yep.
him
Yep.
until 500 years old. And Jesus was only 40. And at another point in the book, which maybe is after this chapter, I'm not sure, it says maybe only 2 years.
Oh, yes. I got that part too. Yes. Yes.
So if we can believe Alexander the Great is definitely real, but nobody wrote his biography till 500 years. Whoa, that's like so much worse. Like even like spread my hands that far apart and still fit in the screen. And so it's like if that is true, then obviously the Bible is true.
Right.
Probably and definitely the Gospels and all
Yep.
their things, which is really all that matters if the Gospels are real, you know, for New Testament believers.
Yeah.
So, it's all the Old Testament stuff we have to find ways of explaining away with like dispensationalism or some shit because because we like to eat shrimp at the buffet.
Because we like to eat shrimp. It's true. That's true.
Anyways, Golden Corral has some great fried shrimp, and that is where we eat after church every Sunday. So we will not be taking the whole command about shellfish. Thank you very much. Okay, so, but that would be kind of hard. That's so. I don't want to say the word deceptive because that implies malicious intent. But I mean, to say exactly what you said, the false equivalence of the word biography specifically, but you really are heavily implying like nothing.
What? Why are you hesitate to say deceptive? I think that's the best word for it. I can't think of a better one, honestly. He knows there are records of Alexander the Great. That's why he didn't say records. He said biography. Like I don't know another word for that, honestly.
I just hope he had a different intent.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, maybe.
I don't know because surely he didn't sit down and write this book thinking I'm going to try to deceive people into believing in my faith. Like, do you think he did?
Yes. I think that's you don't think so, really? You think he was being sincere when he wrote this book? I don't believe for a second.
Yeah.
I didn't back then.
So?
Really? Huh.
Yeah. Like, because I was when I believed like this.
So you think he was an atheist based on how he's talking here? There's no way. There's no way this guy's an atheist. And why would he only? Then again, I haven't seen the rest of it. But from what I remember, it's been 20 years. From what I remember, it was all people from one side who said Jesus was real. He didn't go to anyone who refuted it at all. Like there was like I said, like if he was Karen Armstrong, I'll be shocked. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be a bunch of preachers and theologians that agree with one particular type of theology. I mean, I have no choice but to come to the conclusion that he's being dishonest, especially when the questions are not. Every fifth question is a decent one, and then 4 of them are layups. I just no one who's like going for hard hitting journalism here is going to be asking questions like that and accepting soft ass answers. I that's how I saw it, and maybe I'm still seeing through those eyes. But so far, it hasn't done much to dissuade me from that opinion. That now, are you talking about Strobel or the other guy, the scholar guy?
I'm talking about both of them.
Oh, okay. Because he's
really, yeah. I guess I'm talking about both of them.
Because like the quote
like they believe what they're saying. Like with sincerity,
I do.
They're living their lives based around it.
I wouldn't be surprised if I forgot his name already. His name's a weird name. I can't remember. Blomberg. Maybe. I wouldn't be surprised if Blomberg does believe, like in Christianity and everything like that. I think he does. From the little I've read about him, I think he does. I still think he's being deceptive, though, because the way he framed it, excludes a lot of stuff that would challenge his premise. I think he believes the premise, but he's not interested in going too deep to show how weak it actually is. That Jesus is the Son of God, and we have records 40 years from him. But the closest biography of Alexander, like a guy who's gone to school that much, definitely knows. Like, he studied this more than we have. He absolutely knows that there are records of Alexander the Great that predate his biographies.
What about, like, do you know this? Like, what about like the evidence of Alexander the Great, the coins, etc.?
Mhm.
Are there things like that about Jesus, like from his own
No,
lifetime?
no, there's nothing. That this is it's actually kind of weird. I was surprised when I started studying all this. I
Like, there are
thought
things that claim to be, though.
Hmm?
Like that shroud.
the
that
shroud
we
of yeah,
talked
you're right.
about, and like
The-
the like there, I think, are engravings of him, or sculptures of Jesus, like looking with like the
Mhm.
short, curly blonde
Yeah.
hair early on and stuff. Like, but maybe that wasn't from during.
Yeah,
his life,
you can like the Shroud of Turin.
I can't prove.
Well, the Shroud of Turin's been like dated back to like the
Yeah.
1200s or 1400s or something.
Yeah.
It is a definite forgery. There are like paintings and stuff, but like of stuff that's actually dated back to the time when
For
Jesus would have been
sure.
alive. Yeah, nothing.
For sure.
Nothing.
Just
So the
claim to be,
yeah,
like,
the
this
only
is
thing
how we know that it is. But
yeah,
it's
the
like,
only thing we know are the works of Paul. That is it. That is the only thing we have like written about Jesus, and that's still 20 years after he died. And but yeah, there's nothing. I was kind of surprised to find that out. I thought there would be more. Now, I think that most, if you look at, say what?
I thought there would be more than that.
I did too. I was saying I did too. I was
the Josephus thing. I remember hearing that.
Yeah, Josephus. So Josephus wrote about.
He's unreliable anyway, I've heard.
No, so Josephus has like two main quotes that Christians talk about. Because Josephus did write about early Christianity, like right after Jesus, like a couple decades or something, kind of like the Gospels. And he wrote that, so you have these people in Judea, and they worship this guy who was crucified by the Romans, and they believe he was the Son of God. And there's another writing where he says something like pretty similar, and don't quote me on it, but basically it says that, and this man was Jesus, the Son of God, or something. And that one is the one that most historians think the first half is true. The second half, because Josephus was a Jew and he would have never said that Jesus is the Son of God. That would have never happened. So the first part is talking about the fact that, yeah, in this year, AD 45, there's a bunch of people who worship this guy who was executed by the Romans, and they think he's God. So that's what like an objective scholar who people take seriously wrote about Jesus, but he never met the man. Like he never actually did, and he was never around him at that same time. So that's what they'll talk about Josephus. And Tacitus is a little bit later, but it's pretty much the same thing where they talk about what people believe. But yeah, it's shocking actually that there's no firsthand eyewitness evidence or inscriptions or anything from the time Jesus was alive from anyone talking about him who actually saw him. So it's kind of weird, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of surprising, but if you most scholars, the scholarly consensus is that 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 some person, the Jesus story is based on some person, maybe named Jesus, maybe not, maybe an amalgamation, but like the mythical Jesus hypothesis is a minority one. Like most scholars don't believe that. Yeah, so and it's weird when.
There are even like Aslan and I were talking about, I think the other day, like he
The lion?
no.
Reza Aslan. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The lion.
I know.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The lion.
Yeah. Aslan the lion says that Jesus, the human being, did not exist. It's only about Aslan. The real Lion of Judah.
Nice.
So, but I think most scholars do. Like they think he either an amalgamation, like you said, or the person.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that the stuff Josephus said, I feel like that's pretty strong evidence that he existed. Like he was a human being who lived. Because like why would you make that up and why would people be doing that? Like if Jesus hadn't lived. I don't know. But Paul being God, whether Josephus said that or not, like doesn't like I don't feel like that proves that Jesus was God or not. If Josephus said he was God, like